What if you took an adult and tried to teach them an entire language completely from scratch in the identical way that infants learn languages? So we're talking, you're just going to sit them down and you're going to give them comprehensible input in the language for thousands of hours without teaching them any grammar, any vocab, or anything about the pronunciation of the language. What would happen? J. Marvin Brown actually ran this experiment on a pretty large scale in the 1980s. And the results that he found through running this experiment single-handedly changed the way that I think about language learning in a pretty significant way. So this is the story of J. Marvin Brown and how he ended up running probably the most crazy language learning experiment of all time. So James Marvin Brown was born in 1925 in Salt Lake City, Utah, and he was always fascinated by languages. So when he went to university, he studied 7 different languages in addition to just studying linguistics in general. And for 6 of these 7 languages, he studied it in the way that languages had traditionally been taught up until that point. And this was with a method called the grammar translation method. So this is, in this method of teaching languages, basically you just sit down, you memorize lots of grammar and vocabulary, and then you just translate on paper back and forth between your target language and the native language. So it pretty much has no emphasis on speaking or listening, it's all just reading and writing, and as you can imagine, people who use this method generally didn't actually get very good at communicating in the language that they were studying. So Brown studied the first 6 languages that he learned at university using this kind of old method that wasn't really effective at all. But then for the 7th language, which was Thai, he used this brand new method that had just dropped at the time called the Army method. So this Army method, which was also known as the audiolingual method, had come about through the US government hiring linguists to come up with a brand new way of teaching languages that would actually help soldiers get up to speed in communication ability in foreign languages, so that then they could send these soldiers to the field and they would actually be able to communicate and things like that. Instead of focusing on reading and writing, it had a strong emphasis on speaking and listening, and it was really all about exercises and drills and just trying to grind out practicing the language in order to build communication ability. So Brown's Thai teacher at university was one of the original creators of this new Army method, and she was like, yo, you should use this new method and you'll get really good at Thai. And he's like, okay, cool, sounds good, what should I do? And what the teacher told him to do is, in addition to doing all these drills and exercises to, learn the vocabulary and grammar of Thai, he should really focus on pronunciation as his #1 priority and just grind out the ability to pronounce Thai correctly for a year. And then after that, go to Thailand, just live immersed in the people and language of Thailand for a year, and that should be enough to learn the language. So he was like, okay, cool, makes sense to me, and he got to work grinding. So he started learning Thai in 1953, so he was actually practicing Thai pronunciation using a phonograph. So he had 1 record of different Thai expressions getting pronounced by native speakers, and he would sit with this giant phonograph and just rewind it over and over to hear, 1 sentence getting spoken in Thai, and then he'd mimic it and try to sound as close to the recording. And he'd rewind and listen to it again, he'd imitate it again, and he basically just did this over and over every day for a whole year until he got to the point where he could basically perfectly pronounce Thai and sound almost as good as a native speaker, even though he still didn't have a great grasp of any other aspect of the language. So he did that for a whole year, and then he actually went and lived in Thailand. Now, what he found when he arrived in Thailand was that although he did have good pronunciation and he could, say a sentence that he prepared and people would think he was totally fluent, he basically couldn't understand anything anyone was saying, and it took him way too long to kind of form sentences in his head through, thinking about the grammar and things like that. So he couldn't really communicate with Thai people or make friends or really immerse himself out in the wild, and so he ended up kind of just staying at home in his room and reading lots of Thai novels and studying Thai newspapers and listening to Thai conversations he had recorded on a tape recorder over and over again. Yeah, I just think this is kind of funny because basically that's exactly what happened to me when I went to Japan in high school, so definitely can relate here. But anyway, after he kind of grinded out self-study in Thailand for a year, he finally started to pick up enough of the language that he could get a little more immersed, and he spent the next bunch of years kind of going back and forth between living in Thailand and doing kind of research on Thai linguistics out in the field, and then being in universities back in America and kind of teaching Thai classes and things like that. And as he spent more years living in Thailand and interacting with Thai people, his Thai did get better and better until he eventually reached a pretty kick-ass level of Thai ability. And you can imagine at the time, the number of foreigners living in Thailand was already very, very small, and he was one of the only ones that could actually speak fully fluent Thai with almost perfect pronunciation at a very high level. So he kind of talks about, getting treated like a king for being this super rare specimen of being a foreigner with amazing Thai. In 1962, at the age of 37 years old, Brown finally finishes his dissertation on Thai linguistics, graduates from Cornell University with a PhD, and moves to Thailand permanently. And when he arrives in Thailand, he gets a job at the AUA Language Center, which stands for the American University Alumni Language Center. And this was basically the most prestigious language school in Thailand at the time. So it taught English to Thai people, and it also taught the Thai language to foreigners living in Thailand. And because he had all these different accolades to his name, right? He had a PhD in Thai linguistics from one of the most prestigious universities when it came to linguistics in the whole world. And he was probably the best foreigner in the Thai language. When he went to AUA, the people there basically gave him full control over the whole curriculum. So he could do whatever he wanted when it came to teaching the students. And Brown was very passionate about making the best curriculum possible and actually getting all of his students to become fluent in their target languages, right? Because he had done some language teaching back in American universities because he was kind of forced to as a PhD student. But back then it was all about just making sure the kids passed tests and got good grades, and no one really cared if they actually were mastering their target languages or not. And he thought that that was a bunch of bull, and he was sick of all that. So he really wanted to actually get results for his students. And the way that he thought about it was, he used the army method to learn Thai, and now he was completely kick-ass at Thai, so the army method was the obvious way to go. So he completely changed the whole curriculum for both teaching Thai and teaching English, and he built it around this army method style of having tons of drills and exercises and this kind of drill sergeant style of practicing the language. Now, the weird thing was, although the students that were attending the classes would get better and better at performing these drills, that didn't really seem to carry over to actual language ability. So they'd be in class and they'd be able to do these grammar drills and produce the target language with perfect grammar. They'd do these pronunciation exercises and have very natural pronunciation. But then when they'd go to just spontaneously speak the language with a native speaker, they'd still break all the most common grammar rules and would still have a really thick foreign accent. But Brown did not give up easily. He knew that the army method worked for him, and so he was determined to find a way to make it work for his students. So for 18 years straight, he wrote and rewrote the entire curriculum of his classes, trying to find a way to get the army method to work for his students. He really wanted to produce fluent speakers of the language. But no matter what he did, it just didn't seem to work. His students never really reached a significantly high level in their target languages. Now, alongside this 18 years of just banging his head against the wall, trying to find something that works for his students, his Thai was getting better and better and better. And by the late 1960s, he had what apparently many people described as a legendary level of Thai ability, where people regularly confused him as a native speaker on the phone, and he was getting called to give talks in Thai to native Thai speaker language teachers, and these native speakers would often say that his Thai was even better than theirs were. So again, the army method seemed to work for him. He had achieved this, near native level of Thai ability, yet for whatever reason, it didn't work for his students. So eventually, he kind of got burnt out, and he decided to learn a new language from scratch. Because he realized that although he still really believed in the power of the army method, he had never used the army method alone to master a language to fluency from scratch, right? Because for the Thai language, he used the army method, but then he actually lived in Thailand and he learned a lot through immersion. So in 1983, at the age of 58, Brown decided to go back to America and start studying Japanese in order to prove once and for all that you can use the army method to go from zero to fluent in a language. So he went back to his hometown in Utah, started going to the local university there, and he took Japanese classes and grinded his ass off, practicing for hours every single day. And he didn't get very good at Japanese. But despite this, because he had so much experience teaching languages and because he was at least performing very well in the Japanese classes, getting good grades and things like this, he started to become a kind of teaching assistant to the Japanese classes that were taught there, where he would design the curriculum and work with a native speaker to teach people Japanese. And after his first term, where he designed all of these exercises and drills to help people, really master the content, the student appraisals came in. So you know how at university you take classes and then at the end the school asks you to kind of fill out feedback on what you liked about the class and what you thought of the teacher and stuff so they can improve the curriculum. So he taught his first Japanese class at this university, and then he got these student appraisals, and he was expecting them to be really good because he thought that he had taught a kick-ass class. But it turned out that all the students completely hated him and hated his class. And to Brown, this was a huge shock, and it was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and he really just felt like giving up on everything, right? He had this dream of helping students reach fluency in a language, and it just felt like after literally decades of banging his head against the wall, nothing worked, and he really just hit rock bottom. So he writes in his autobiography that he literally cried himself to sleep that night that he got back the student appraisals. Now, the very next day after Brown cried himself to sleep, he went to visit his friend and colleague Adrian Palmer. And Adrian hands him a book which had just been released at the time. And this book was The Natural Approach by Stephen Krashen and Terry Terrell. Now, the interesting thing was, this was not Brown's first exposure to Krashen. Brown had actually read one of Krashen's earlier books a few years prior, but he didn't really take it seriously and kind of just wrote the whole thing off because, to him, he already knew how to learn a language, right? It was the army method. But now, after finally hitting rock bottom and truly giving up, he was finally ready to consider entirely new possibilities. So he read Stephen Krashen's book with an open mind, and to him, it was a sudden conversion.
We have two very different ways of going about the job of getting better in another language. You can acquire language, you can learn language, and they're very different. Acquisition, I've described as a subconscious process. Very different from acquisition is what we call learning. That's what most of us did in school. Learning is knowing about language, conscious knowledge of language. The important role is with acquisition. Acquisition gives us fluency and accuracy. I think we all acquire language in exactly the same way. The way we acquire language is amazingly simple. We acquire language when we understand messages. When people speak to us in another language and we understand what they say, language acquisition will take place. In fact, language acquisition takes place necessarily. It's unavoidable. You can't help it. Given messages people understand, what we call comprehensible input, the language acquisition device goes to work. It happens subconsciously, automatically, and inevitably.
Brown had this huge epiphany that the main reason he had got so godly at Thai was not because he'd used the army method, but because he had got insane amounts of comprehensible input. You see, Brown had this habit for over a decade where pretty much every single night he'd go to these Thai pubs where you could basically pay to have hot Thai girls just hang out with you. And he would go there literally every single night and listen to hot Thai girls just talk to each other in Thai for multiple hours every single night for over a decade. So at the time, he didn't think of this as, getting input or learning the language or anything like that. To him, it was just a stupid way of blowing steam. But he realized that it was just that blowing steam that actually probably contributed more than anything to him having such a high level of natural Thai ability. So Brown was now a 100% Krashen convert. In fact, he was almost more Krashen than Krashen himself. He wanted to take Krashen's core theories on how people acquire languages, and he wanted to put them into a classroom setting where they would really be tested to their limits and applied in their 100% full glory. So the next term at this university that he was at Utah, he started a natural approach Thai class where he taught people the Thai language 100% through comprehensible input. Now, at the beginning, the classes didn't go well at all because when you try to do this type of class where you're only teaching purely through comprehensible input, you're immediately faced with this extremely difficult issue of how do you generate input that is both comprehensible and engaging to people that literally don't understand a single word of the language, right? So he was trying lots of different things. He said he was staying up all night trying to brainstorm different ideas of activities he could fill the class with. And he was doing things like trying to give the students commands or orders and then have them follow the orders. Some stuff kind of worked. Most things didn't work. But one day he had a huge breakthrough when he brought his wife to class. So remember, he was in America at this point teaching people the Thai language, and he was doing all the speaking himself, right? Because he was the only one that spoke Thai. So he started to get worried that his students might be thinking that they weren't getting real Thai because the only Thai they're hearing is from a foreigner. So one day he brought his Thai wife into class because he had married a Thai woman in Thailand many years before. And he did this just so that he could show the students him and his wife speaking with each other, and then the students would realize that his Thai sounds exactly like hers. and this was just kind of a way of flexing to his students that his Thai was basically native level. But what he realized was when it was him and his wife, and now you had two speakers of the language and they were engaging with each other, that made it way easier to create this engaging, comprehensible input, and it opened up way more possibilities. So this ended up being a huge breakthrough, right? Even Krashen himself, most of the way that he came up with how to create comprehensible input basically had to do with somebody one teacher standing at the front of the class and just talking into a void, basically. But what Brown realized was most language use happens for communication, right? In order to communicate, you need two people going back and forth. And so when you had two different people, they could interact with each other, they could have fights with each other, they could help each other out, they could act out whole scenarios using different props and things like this. And this really opened up a whole world of possibility when it came to creating this comprehensible and engaging input, even for people that were complete beginners in the language. So Brown ended up running this natural approach Thai class for a few terms at this university in America, and overall it went really well. You know, like I was saying, it was still pretty bumpy and there were a lot of rough edges, but overall the students actually really enjoyed the class, and they seemed to be getting better and better at understanding Thai, even though all they were doing was getting comprehensible input. So Brown ended up accepting an offer to move back to Thailand and go back to teaching at AUA, the school which he had taught at for 18 years previously. But this time, he was only going to develop this class that teaches 100% through comprehensible input. And this class ended up going on to be called ALG, or Automatic Language Growth. So, like I was saying before, Brown had gone from one extreme to the opposite extreme, and he was now a hardcore believer in Krashen's theories, which said that we don't acquire language through speaking the language, we only acquire the language through getting input. And any time that we're speaking the language, we're simply using what we've already acquired, and we're not learning anything new.
If you want to improve your English, it will not help you to speak English to yourself as you drive to work in the morning in your car. The ability to speak a language is a result of getting language acquisition, not its cause.
So Brown now had this hypothesis that if Krashen was correct, once someone had a sufficient critical mass of input in their target language, they should start being able to naturally speak spontaneously. Speech should just emerge, as Krashen said. And so he really wanted to put this hypothesis to the test. So he made a rule in his ALG classes that students were not allowed to speak until they've had 500 hours of classroom input. Now, unfortunately, most students didn't follow this rule, and they just spoke right from the beginning anyway. And it's kind of understandable why this is, because most people who are learning a foreign language as an adult, speaking is kind of what it's all about, right? It's kind of the goal we all have in mind. We all are really excited to speak. We want to go and talk to native speakers. And we have this very deep-rooted idea that the only way to get good at speaking is through speaking. So it was very hard to convince students that it was actually in their best interest to wait. Plus, you know, they were living in Thailand. This whole school is in Thailand, so it was probably pretty impractical to try to completely avoid speaking anyway. So unfortunately, most of the students did just start speaking the language from the beginning, but there were some students who followed the rules and actually completely waited to speak the language. So basically what happened was Brown hired more and more teachers, and he trained these teachers, and they over time they got better and better at coming up with ways to make engaging, comprehensible input. They experimented with different things, they discovered more and more techniques that work really well, they just kind of got really adept at it. The classes always consisted of 2 native Thai speakers standing at the front of the classroom and interacting with each other, and directly interacting with all of the students that were sitting in the classroom and listening. But a key component was that when the students did have to speak something back, they would never speak Thai, they would just speak back in English, or respond back with hand gestures or face gestures and things like this. Because again, Brown had forbid people from speaking early, and he didn't want people to be forcing early output. Now, the students would go to these classes for 5 hours a day for 5 days a week. And so obviously they were racking up these hours of input very quickly, and it was kind of a full-time commitment from the students. But what ended up happening was that the comprehension ability of the students right from the beginning grew very rapidly. They got better and better at understanding Thai. But the real question for Brown was, would speech eventually emerge naturally, right? Like, of course, they were the people that ignored his instructions and were forcing early output from the beginning. But for those people that actually followed the instructions and they didn't output for the first 500 plus hours, would eventually they just open their mouth and Thai would start coming out? And the answer was yes. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt the story, but I have to give a quick plug for my online community called Immersion Dojo. So at Immersion Dojo, every week we do a live workshop where I hear from you, answer any questions you have, help you work through any sticking points in your language learning, and also talk about a lot of my new ideas and recommendations regarding language learning. So in these last couple years, I've learned a lot more about language learning that I didn't used to know, a lot of which has been informed by ALG and J. Marvin Brown's thinking. So I have a whole new series of recommendations regarding what the best way to learn a new language is. I'm eventually going to turn those all into nicely edited videos that you can watch for free on my channel, but that's going to take a while. So for now, I kind of have a quick and dirty version on the Immersion Dojo for all the community members. And right now we have a really cool community going where we have really passionate language learners sharing resources and trying out these new techniques and getting really exciting results. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely check it out. Would love to have you. It's $18 a month. And without further ado, let's get back to the story. Once the first cohort of ALG students reached around 500 hours of classroom comprehensible input, at first it was the Southeast Asians that kind of spontaneously started speaking the language. At first one, and then a little bit later another student, and then a little later another student. And after a certain amount of time, a significant portion of the students that had waited to output started naturally speaking Thai. Now, they weren't perfect right off the bat, although they had very, very clear pronunciation, and the mistakes that they were making were not the typical mistakes that foreign speakers of Thai normally make. They kind of resembled more the mistakes that infants make when they first start speaking Thai as their native language. And what happened was, as those students continued to get even more input and continue to practice speaking the language, their output would get more and more accurate, and they would make less and less mistakes over time, even without ever getting explicitly corrected on the mistakes that they were making. So at first it was the Southeast Asians who started naturally speaking after around 500 hours, and then once that original cohort reached around 900 hours of comprehensible input, then some of the Westerners and Japanese speakers started to join in as well. So unsurprisingly, people whose native language was farther away from Thai needed more hours of input to get to that same point. But eventually, even the Westerners whose native language was extremely far removed from Thai, they also started organically speaking once they had 900 hours of classroom comprehensible input. Now, like I said a second ago, the way that the ALG classes were structured was that you had 5 hours a day of classroom comprehensible input for 5 days a week. And the entire ALG program ended up being 18 months long. So over the course of 18 months, you would end up getting a total of 1,800 hours of classroom input. And what would happen was, for the Western students, I'll just talk about Westerners and kind of leave out the Southeast Asians just to kind of simplify the conversation. But what would happen on average for the Westerners who actually followed the instructions and didn't force speaking early was that after around 900 hours, they would start spontaneously speaking, but that was only halfway through the program. So they'd continue to get 5 hours a day, 5 days a week of this comprehensible input, and they'd start speaking more and more, and the quality of their output, along with their comprehension, would continue to grow more and more. And once they'd hit that 18-month mark, or 1,800 hours of comprehensible input, they would be full-blown fluent in Thai. So Brown did it. He proved Krashen's hypotheses that it's possible to become fluent in a foreign language even as an adult, even if you're only learning 100% through comprehensible input. But that's not even the most impressive thing. The most impressive thing is what happened to the students after they would graduate from the ALG program. So Brown started having students that would go to the ALG program for a year and a half, reach basic fluency in Thai, and then they'd go on and just live their lives in Thai. And in just a few years, the students would go on to actually be better at the Thai language than Brown was himself. And remember, Brown had a so-called legendary level of Thai ability. So Brown mentions one student in particular named David Long, who went to ALG for just 1 year of full-time classes, and then after that went to just live his life in Thailand for about 4 years. And he was a big fan of the program, so he'd often come by to just check in with Brown and kind of report how his life was going. And after around 1 full year of ALG classes, followed by 4 years of just living his life casually in Thailand without doing anything in particular to actively improve his Thai ability, David Long ended up being better at Thai than Brown was, and this was under Brown's own admission. So Brown's ALG program was able to produce near native level Thai speakers purely through comprehensible input without having to go through any grind work, any memorization, any practice or anything like this. People would just show up to the classes. The classes apparently were actually really fun because you're just watching native speakers basically do skits and interact with you. And then you just go live your life in Thailand and pick things up through natural immersion like native speakers do. And then you end up with a near native level of ability. So if this story is true, then in my opinion, it's the most profound thing that has ever happened in the world of second language acquisition. But the thing is, the story doesn't end there. In fact, it's what I'm about to talk about next that had the biggest influence on my own ideas related to language acquisition. So, although ALG was able to produce some near native level speakers of Thai purely through comprehensible input, this was only a relatively small minority of the ALG students. Most of the ALG students never actually went on to get very good at Thai. So, of course, Brown got to work trying to analyze what's the difference between the students that get these incredible results and the students that get relatively crummy results. Well, the first thing that he noticed that was really obvious was the students that spoke early and broke his rule about waiting to speak pretty much never went on to sound that good. So like I said before, no matter how hard Brown tried, he was never very successful at getting the majority of students to wait before they started speaking the language. Most students would just start forcing output right from day one. And all of these students that did this forced early output never went on to be near native level in Thai. Even if they completed the entire ALG program and then lived in Thailand for many years after that, they would go on to always speak the language with a kind of typical foreign accent and broken grammar. It was only the people that waited to speak until speech emerged naturally that went on to reach a near native level in Thai. So the first conclusion that Brown came to was that forcing early output somehow causes permanent damage to the language acquisition process. But it quickly became clear that this wasn't the only factor at play, because although all of the students that forced early output never went on to speak very good Thai, within the pool of students that did wait to do early output, some of them would go on to reach a near native level and others would go on to speak relatively broken Thai. So there was clearly more factors at play that Brown had to isolate. And what he eventually was able to realize was that students who would do things like ask questions about the language and about what things mean, look words up in the dictionary, or take notes about the different words or grammar that they were trying to learn, would generally never go on to get very good at the language. So at this point, Brown had coined what he called the terrible four. Forced early output, looking words up in the dictionary, taking notes, and asking questions about the language. People who did any of these four activities would generally never go on to reach a near native-like level of ability in the language. But even so, there were still some people who didn't do any of the terrible four, would on the surface look like they were perfectly doing the ALG method, yet would still go on to speak relatively poor level Thai and wouldn't reach that native-like level. So there was some mystery X factor that Brown still wasn't able to isolate. And it wasn't until Brown tried to use the ALG method himself to learn a new language that it became clear what this final X factor was. Brown wanted to learn a language through the ALG method himself to gain first-hand experience, because he knew that that would allow him to design even better classes. And it just so happened that some of the ALG teachers were native speakers of the Suotao dialect of Chinese. So Brown threw together a Suotao Chinese ALG class for him and the other teachers so that they could all get some direct experience learning a language through ALG. Brown continued this Suotao ALG class for 1 to 2 hours a day for 8 years straight. So we ended up going on to get literally thousands of hours of Suotao input. But despite this, he never became fluent in the language. And the reason for this, he realized, was because while getting input, he was thinking about the language too much. You see, Brown was a trained linguist, and according to him, he was one of the best linguists alive. And so he couldn't help himself but compulsively analyze every little aspect about the language. Without even really trying to, he was consciously analyzing the tones and the grammar structures and making comparisons between the other languages that he knew to try to deduce what different morphemes and different words would mean. And he basically was doing a lot of conscious study, you could almost say, on the language just by listening. So even though on the surface he was just sitting there and listening and he wasn't doing early output or taking notes or looking words up, he was basically doing the equivalent of that all in his head just by analyzing the language. Now, he writes in his autobiography that, of course, there were moments where the interactions between the two native speakers were so engaging that he would forget to analyze it. He'd just get caught up in the moment. And when that happened, he would truly acquire different words in the language. And he talks about how there were certain words there he acquired them naturally just through input without consciously thinking about them. And for those words, he could use them pretty naturally if he ever tried to speak the language. It's like those words would just pop into his head. Whereas for all the other words and different aspects of the language which he consciously learned through analyzing the language, he could only use them through consciously thinking them up. So we kind of found that the aspects of the language that were acquired unconsciously, he could use naturally and felt very natural to him. But for the aspects that he consciously learned through analyzing the language, through thinking, he had to think to use those aspects of the language, and they never really went on to feel very natural. And this experience led him to add on to the terrible 4 and turn it into the terrible 5. There was no forced early output, no taking notes, no looking words up, no asking questions about the language, and no analyzing the language. And what he realized was that you could simplify this terrible 5 down into a terrible 1, which is no thinking about the language. That's the common denominator between all 5 of these factors. Whenever you're trying to use your conscious mind to contrive the language or consciously understand the language, that is a completely different process than the unconscious process of naturally acquiring the language, and that first process actually interferes with the second process. So the more that you consciously contrive and consciously analyze the language, that has permanent negative effects on how much you'll be able to acquire that language through unconscious acquisition. Brown eventually ran ALG for 11 years before retiring in 1995 and passing down the ALG program to his star student David Long, who continues to run ALG at AUA in Thailand to this day. Brown's ultimate conclusion, which he came to after spending 11 years teaching thousands of students through comprehensible input and producing dozens of speakers who were able to speak Thai at a near native level, was that even as adults, we never lose the ability to acquire languages in the exact same way that infants do. Instead, we actually gain the ability to engage in a completely different process, which is using our conscious minds to analyze and think about language. But this conscious process actually gets in the way of the natural acquisition process. So if we're only able to kind of get out of our own ways and not engage this conscious process, no matter how old we get, we always have access to that same kind of magic that infants use to become native level at whatever language they're exposed to. But what about Brown's own Thai? Although Brown did learn a lot through immersion over the years, he also did a lot of this conscious study in the language, which he later came to the conclusion causes permanent damage. But in spite of this, he apparently had legendary Thai and would often get confused for a native speaker. Well, according to Brown, his own Thai was a kind of hybrid. He did rely on a conscious monitor when he spoke Thai, and that made the act of speaking Thai feel very different than speaking English. He has this quote that always really resonated with me because honestly, I feel the same is true about my own Japanese. When I speak Thai, I think in Thai. When I speak English, I think only in thought. I pay no attention to English. Brown passed away in 2002 at the age of 77, shortly before completing an autobiography titled From the Outside In. After his passing, his close family and friends published this autobiography for free online, and that's what the majority of this video has been based on. I highly recommend reading the entire autobiography yourself because Brown left us with so many insights which I wasn't able to include in this video.